Hi again then guys, and welcome to another car review from, of course, the 1.50 selection in GT Sport, and this one is a very highly requested car, of course, since pretty much day one in this game. A fan favourite, an iconic car, you could say a modern classic even. I don't think many people would argue with that. Of course, the E46 generation BMW M3. A car which is famous and popular for a wide variety of reasons, everything from motorsport to being a great sports coupe, a great sports car in general, to having an iconic colour, of course Phoenix Gelb, which a lot of people love this car in, including myself, and even pop culture in games like Need for Speed Most Wanted, albeit in a slightly different form. Of course, the GTR variation. Now, this car is the regular one. It's not the CS or Club Sport. It's not the CSL, the Club Sport Lightweight, and it's not the GTR, which of course many people do like, but it's a fairly obvious choice to bring this one back. Now, of course, we already reviewed this car in GT6. It was a great car, but not necessarily a car which I saw, at least, many people using. You'd see some people in lobbies, but it tended to be a more popular drift car, and also a car that people would lower and stance, and like using cruises. Not so much the racing side of things, which is kind of surprising really, considering how good the GTR race car always was in Gran Turismo. It had fantastic handling, almost like a DTM car kind of vibe, rather than a GT machine, which is of course what it was. Now, as far as this one goes, it's definitely one of those vehicles which has actually benefited from Gran Turismo Sport's kind of racing system with the N classes rather than the performance points, because even though those classes don't always make the best sense, it does definitely benefit some cars. And also the fact that there are fewer cars in the game means that the cars that are in there do tend to get spotlighted more. So for instance, something like a Maserati Gran Turismo is actually far more useful in this game than it was in the last one, because in Gran Turismo 6 there were so many better cars to choose from, put simply, that it wasn't necessary. Whereas now, as I mentioned the other day, I've tuned my Maserati to N400 and it's brilliant. I've genuinely beaten people online in 911 GT3s, even on the Nürburgring. So cars that many people didn't use before, they're being more inclined to now. I would think, and I fully expect, that that similar phenomena will happen with this car as well, because even though it already has a ton of fans, even those fans didn't seem to use it that much in GT6 online lobbies. As I said, I would very rarely see it. Now, in terms of the spec, there are certain things that many of you probably already know. It's a very well-known car, 3.2 litre engine, 6-cylinder of course, it's rear-wheel drive as you'd expect, just under 340 horsepower, so comfortably in N300. Incidentally though, you can detune this car to N200, which is very spicy, and I'm curious to see how good that is as a track car once I apply my tuning to it as well. You're looking at 269 pound-feet of torque, which doesn't sound amazing, but when you consider that the Jaguar Vision GT car only has 295 pound-feet, that's actually not too bad in comparison. And the weight is modest. It's not crazy heavy, it's certainly no lightweight, of course that's why they made a lighter version, but 1,560 kilos is not bad. It's a Beamer, it's a 4-seater, it's a decent sized coupe, it's not trying to be a super light track car, and of course one of the reasons why that weight is acceptable and why the power and performance is good is because a car like this, and this is something that BMW does very well and they always have, it's not necessarily designed to be the fastest thing around. They're not even aiming for that. What they're aiming for is a driver's car. That's the whole purpose of the M3 lineage. And even though pretty much every, if not every, generation of M3 has gone racing in some form or another, sometimes multiple forms, the first and foremost goal that BMW have with every M3, and you could argue with every M car in general, but this is where it really shows, just like with Porsche's 911 being the flagship, this is the car that they want to really transmit to the car community as a whole what BMW is capable of when it comes to driving enjoyment, to the passion of driving. Not just setting the best lap, but having the most fun you possibly can during the lap. And there's a big difference between those two things. You compare this car to, for instance, a vehicle that I talk about quite a lot on the other end of the spectrum, the Nissan GTR. It's a car which tons of people love, but very few of those people tend to say, oh, I love the passion of a Nissan GTR. It's just not known for that. It's known for being overwhelmingly competitive, capable, and fast. but that doesn't make it fun. It's just fast. Now, some people find that fun, and that's fair enough, but fun to many people, including myself, is more the way a car looks, the way it sounds, even the way it gives you feedback through the handling. You don't need to get around a corner as quickly as possible, you just enjoy the corner. And even though my real-world experience with BMW comes in the form of the i8, which is a totally different car to this, I could still understand certain elements that that car gave to me while I was driving it that would certainly translate over to something like this, even though it's slightly older. For instance, they actually share a lot in common that you wouldn't think. The power output is fairly similar, neither of them are overly torquey cars in a general sense. They're not super light, they're not super heavy, and the engine capacity isn't that large. So overall, the i8 and the M3 are actually more similar than you might think. Plus, they're both designed to be more engaging, passionate, and soulful than they are just fast. They both most definitely have that in common. Now, this M3, I will be honest, for me personally, despite the praise that I'm giving it, has never been one of my favourite sports coupes on the market. Maybe it's the oversaturation, because it's so popular, for a similar reason why I've never really been a Subaru WRX fan that much, because so many people love the car. But at the same time, if many people love something, it tends to be because it's good. So it's not that I'm knocking the car in any form. It's a great car. Now, in terms of how it's projected into this game, how it looks, how it sounds, how they've made it perform, I would say that the way it looks is good. My only qualm is it looks a little bit narrow from the back. I've always thought of this M3 as being a little bit chunkier than it looks in the game, but Gran Turismo tends to be pretty accurate to real life when it comes to that kind of thing, so I'll give them the benefit of the doubt there. The handling is superb. I expected it to be far more tail-happy than it actually is, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Again, it's very good through corners. A little soft, if anything. You might want to tighten up the suspension. In fact, quite a bit if you're turning it into a pure track machine. But, of course, as I mentioned in the overarching review that I did for 1.50 as an update, the biggest thing that I've always disliked about this car is easily the sound. It sounds weird. It's a car that doesn't sound as good as it looks, as far as I'm concerned. And, of course, that's part of the six-cylinder layout that the car has. It just doesn't sound as beefy as you would hope it does. To me, the E92 M3 does. It barks like you'd expect a V8 too, a 4-litre V8. This is not a V8, of course, but at the same time, TVRs, for instance, are commonly 6-cylinder. The Tuscan barks in real life. It's got a great sounding engine. To me, this M3 just never sounded that good. It's got a slightly howling wind kind of note to it, as I mentioned before. Like I said, kind of like a hairdryer, and that's a very insulting way to say it, but it's the best example I can give, and it also very much reminds me of the early 2000s Porsche Boxster sound, which again is just this kind of high wind whistling sort of noise which almost overpowers any kind of deeper notes that the car has to show off, and that's kind of a shame. Now, of course, sports exhausts and that kind of thing can change that, but not in the game. And incidentally, in terms of this car's ability, beyond just being fun but actually being good for racing, if it is good for racing, I would say that this is definitely one to look out for N200, because having a car that's already this good and detuning it tends to result in a pretty good vehicle. Now, the weight is a little higher than your NSXs and 911s, but it's still worth a look. I would say that this is definitely worth looking into as an N200 detune, definitely an N300 car because it's already very good at that level, and potentially N400 because it is lighter than an E92, you can easily tune it up to that level, and the handling will definitely suit many people. I have no doubt you'll see this in a ton of cruise lobbies, a ton of drift lobbies, and rightfully so. It's a great car for all of those things. My most common use will probably be circuit, if anything, for this car. So, as I said, I'm very curious to see how it lines up against my other N300 and maybe even N200 builds. But overall, that's it for my thoughts. Of course, if you've got this M3 already, chances are you have, because it's only an 84 grand car anyway, then tell me what you think down below. And of course, I'll see you next time. But until then, as always, thanks for watching.